When the last torment in the village ended, the adults for the first time stopped laughing at the boy whom they had called a savage all summer. Before that, they'd seen him as a strange child, wandering the forest with sacks, collecting acorns, stripping bark from fallen trees, and hiding the grey, coarse flour as if it were gold. He was teased at school. They laughed at him at the store. Even the adults said that after his father's death, the boy had gone completely wild and would soon begin living like a little animal in a hole. But winter did not come as expected. It didn't just block the roads. It cut the village off from the mill, the station, and help. It froze the wells, stopped the stream, buried barns under snow, and forced people to burn their own furniture to survive another night. The children stopped begging for bread. They simply lay under their blankets in silence, and that silence was more frightening than any wind. The last sack of flour remained in the shop. The men argued over who would get it. The women hid their empty baskets behind their backs. The wealthy shopkeeper still tried to hold on to power, but even his keys meant nothing anymore. Because there was no escape beyond the warehouse door, and just then that same boy entered the shop. On his shoulders were sacks of what everyone called trash, acorns, bark, dark flour that had been laughed at all summer. The adults didn't yet know that very soon they would have to choose between pride and hunger. They didn't yet know that this boy was hiding not just supplies, but knowledge that his father would have taken to the grave if the son hadn't memorized every word. When Samuel Price's barn was full of flour for just one last batch, no one in Black Creek laughed at the boy who had spent the summer collecting acorns and bark. It became difficult to laugh at all. Laughter requires warmth, but on that January evening, not even the warmth of their fingers remained. The wind battered the walls as if it wanted not just to tear away the planks, but to tear the very memory of summer from the village. Snow lay above the windows, the well froze to the timbers, and the road to the mill had disappeared before Christmas. Horses that could have fought their way to the neighbouring town stood with their heads bowed, chewing the last wisps of hay mixed with straw. Inside the houses, broken chairs, old boxes, and even pantry shelves were burned, for those who thought the winter would be ordinary had long since run out of firewood. Price's shop smelled of cold ash, wet wool, and fear. A sack of flour lay on the counter, clutched tightly as if someone had already tried to squeeze it dry. Samuel Price, the shopkeeper, a heavy-chinned man with a habit of speaking as if the city belonged to him, held the sack with both hands. His fingers trembled not from weakness, but from anger. He was used to counting, distributing, lending, and taking back 3 times as much in the spring. But now even his debt books meant nothing. You couldn't collect grain from a man who had no grain left. Around the counter stood women with empty baskets, farmers with weather-beaten faces, and 3 old men who, back in the fall, had assured everyone they'd seen worse winters. Mrs. Harper sat by the stove, holding her youngest daughter on her lap. The girl didn't cry. When children are hungry, they first cry, then ask questions, then remain silent. This silence frightened the adults more than any wind. "Is this enough for everyone?" one of the women asked. Price didn't answer right away. He looked at the bag, then at the faces, then at the frosted window, beyond which day was already turning to grey night. The answer was too obvious to speak out loud. There was enough flour for a cauldron of thin soup if you added snow water and ground up everything that could still be considered food. For one evening, maybe for the morning if you fed the children first and only let the adults lick the spoon. And then the shop door opened. Eli Whitcomb, a 12-year-old boy wearing an old buckskin jacket given to him after his father's death, walked inside. A sack, tied with a belt, hung over his shoulders. He dragged a second sack across the floor, leaving a wet trail of snow on the boards. His hair was matted with frost. His lips were chapped, his face was thin, but his eyes remained calm. Not frightened, not guilty, not childish. They were the eyes of a man who had long ago understood what others were only just beginning to grasp. Price saw the bags and frowned. "What have you brought again, savage?" The word hung in the shop, but no longer provoked laughter. It had done so before. All summer and all fall the boy was called that. Savage, forest puppy, squirrel apprentice, boy with bark in his pockets. Children shouted it after him outside the school. Men repeated it in the shop as he passed with sacks full of acorns. Women shook their heads when they saw him strip the thin inner bark from fallen birches and carefully fold it into a linen sack, as if he were collecting not trash, but treasure. Eli wasn't offended. He'd long since stopped being offended. He simply set the first sack down by the counter, untied the strap, and poured the dry, shelled acorns onto the boards. They fell heavily, evenly, with a soft wooden thud. Then he untied the second sack. Inside were folded strips of dried bark, dark cakes of ground nuts, and small canvas bags filled with something grey, like coarse flour. "This isn't a joke, Mr. Price," Eli said. "It's edible." The shop became even quieter. Outside, a wind slammed against the wall, and somewhere above the door, a sign creaked mournfully. Price looked at the acorns as if the boy had dumped an insult in front of him, not food. His face was a war of two emotions, contempt and hunger. Contempt clung to habit. Hunger looked at the sacks. "People don't eat bark," Price said. Eli looked up. "People eat everything when there is nothing else." These words didn't please anyone. Not because they were impudent, because they were true. 4 months earlier, when dry grass still lay on the hills and morning mist rose from the creek, Black Creek had looked like a confident settlement. Not rich, not large, but confident. 27 houses, a store, a blacksmith shop, a school, a small church, and a mill on the South Creek. People said the location was well chosen. The forest was nearby, the water was close, the soil was black, the cattle grew fat in the meadows, and the railroad station was only 2 days' wagon ride away. 2 days in the summer seemed like nothing. In the winter, those same 2 days could be the distance to another world. Eli knew this better than most adults, but no one considered his knowledge genuine. His father, Jonah Whitcomb, had died the previous winter while searching for a missing cow beyond the North Ravine. The storm had come half an hour beforehand, so swift that people later spoke of it in whispers, as if the weather itself were eavesdropping. Jonah wasn't found until 9 days later, when the wind had cleared the edge of the ravine. He was sitting under a pine tree, his face covered by his sleeve, and nearby in the snow were tracks that showed he had walked less than a mile from home. After that, Eli's mother almost stopped talking. She worked, washed, mended, prayed, but there was something empty in her movements, as if the core of her remained there, under the northern pine. The Whitcomb household had little land, little money, and few people willing to help for free. In the spring, Price took their cow for the flour debt. In the fall, he would have taken the house as well, if not for old Pastor Merrill, who persuaded him to wait until spring. Eli heard everything. He stood at the shop door when Price told his mother that pity doesn't feel sacks. He saw his mother nod without arguing, because arguing with someone who has your receipt is like arguing with the cold. That day, Eli understood for the first time a simple thing. Adults call it order, but order only helps those who already have a barn, livestock, and a supply of flour. A week later, he went into the forest. He didn't run, he didn't hide. He simply took his father's old knife, a grain sack, and went beyond the northern ravine, where oaks, birches, and a few pines that had survived the fires grew. His father had shown him more than once in his lifetime that the forest isn't empty, even when it seems empty. There's a root beneath the snow. There's inner bark within the trunk. Acorns have a bitterness, but if you soak them in water, changing the water again and again, the bitterness goes away. Then the acorns can be dried, ground, and added to flour. It's not tasty, not soft, not like store-bought bread, but it's food. And food that can be preserved becomes more important than pride in winter. Eli brought home his first bag of acorns at the end of August. He walked across the main street, bent under the weight, and the children at the school were the first to see him. "Here comes the squirrel!" Price's eldest son shouted. "Hey, Eli, are you digging a hollow for the winter?" The children laughed. Miss Reynolds, the teacher, peered out the window, but didn't stop them. She was a kind woman when kindness didn't require inconvenience. Eli walked past without answering. If he had, the laughter would have gotten louder. Silence tires people faster. That's what he thought then. But people are not tired. A few days later, he was spotted among the birch trees. He was carefully cutting away the rough outer layer of a fallen tree, getting to the light inner bark. He didn't touch living trunks unless necessary, because his father had taught him, if you kill a tree for one sack, it won't save anyone next winter. But the adults didn't ask why he chose only fallen trees. They saw the boy with the bark and drew conclusions faster than the wind dries footprints. "Now he eats trees," said Wallace the blacksmith at his shop. "What can you expect from him?" Price replied, standing on the porch. After his father died, the boy went completely wild. This word stuck. Savage. At first it was a joke, then it became a name. Even those who pitied Eli said it with a slight smile, as if pity gave them the right. Mrs. Harper once tried to say that the boy was simply helping his mother, but Price chuckled and pointed to his full warehouse. "You should help your mother by working, not by hauling trash from the forest. Flour comes from the mill, Mrs. Harper. Bread is made from wheat. That's how civilized people live." Then everyone agreed. Because in August, it's easy to believe in flour. In August, the barns smell of grain, the chickens dig into dust, the cows give milk, and the road to the station is hard and dry. In August, it seems like winter is just a cold time that must be endured, like rain or a Sunday sermon. No one wants to think that winter might come not as a season, but as a siege. Eli fought. He counted not days, but sacks, not promises, but what could be stored in the cellar. He and his mother had less than half a barrel of flour, a few beans, dried apples from the pasture, and 2 jars of molasses. This wouldn't last even until mid-January if the winter dragged on. And it could drag on. His father said this every year, and every year he was laughed at too. Jonah Whitcomb was one of those people who checked the sky more often than the calendar. He noticed when squirrels began hiding more than usual, when birds left early, when mice crawled into houses in the fall so desperately as if they were being chased by invisible water. In September, Eli saw it all for himself. The squirrels worked tirelessly. The geese flew low and early. In the evenings, the marsh was so still you could hear the ice gripping the water's edge with a thin, glassy ringing. He also noticed the oak trees. There were more acorns than usual. Too many. They rained down on the ground at night, pounding the roots, choking the grass, and rolling into the ditches. The adults rejoiced. The pigs would be fed. Eli saw it differently. The forest doesn't waste energy. If the trees gave so much, it meant something in the earth, the air, and the cold had compelled them to hurry. He started collecting every day. First, 1 sack at a time, then 2. He soaked the acorns in the stream, weighing them down with stones in wicker baskets. The water turned brown with bitterness, and he changed it again. Then he dried them on the roof of the barn while the autumn sun still held warmth. Then he pounded them in a mortar his father had once made from a piece of elm. His hands blistered, his shoulders ached, but the grey-brown flour gradually accumulated in the canvas bags. At first, the mother was silent. Then one evening, she approached the table, picked up a pinch of acorn flour, rubbed it between her fingers, and looked at her son as if she saw not a boy, but a stubborn little man. "Your father would do the same," she said. For Eli, this meant more than any praise in the village. But the village continued to laugh. When he carried bark, they teased him. When he collected acorns, they tossed stones over him as if he were feeding an animal. When he refused to sell his supplies to Price for a few cents, the storekeeper declared the boy had become greedy for garbage. Eli didn't explain. He knew. Explanations were needed only by those willing to listen. Black Creek wasn't ready. The first snow fell at the beginning of November. It fell at night, quiet and dense, covering the ground ankle deep. In the morning, people came out onto their porches and said it was beautiful. By midday, the snow had begun to fall again. 2 days later, the road to the mill became difficult. A week later, Price's wagon got stuck on the South Creek and returned halfway through. By the end of the month, the mill wheel stopped because the creek was frozen. No one was truly afraid then. Price had a warehouse, farmers had sacks, women had jars on their shelves. People were used to believing what they saw. Meanwhile, Eli was sitting in the barn, pouring the last of the dried bark into a wooden box. He signed the lid with charcoal, even though no one but he and his mother were supposed to open it. For February. The mother saw the inscription and turned pale. "Do you think things will be bad until February?" Eli didn't answer right away. He listened to the wind. It hadn't roared yet, hadn't beaten against the walls yet, but it already held a low, heavy promise. "I think," he said finally, "that by February, people will remember everything they laughed at." He was wrong about only one thing. They remembered earlier. By mid-December, Black Creek had ceased to resemble a village and became a row of dark roofs, randomly protruding from the snow. The fences were the first to disappear. Then came the ditches, the paths, the lower steps of the porches. People walked from house to house along narrow passages cut with shovels, and each new snowfall erased them so quickly, as if someone were deliberately closing the village's eyes. During the first few weeks, a sense of confidence still clung to the feeling. The men said they simply needed to wait it out. The women stretched the dough thinner, added more water, dried herbs, and the last of the root vegetables to the stew. At school, Miss Reynolds began letting the children go early because the oven couldn't keep up with the classroom heating, and the ink in the bottles was thickening right on the desks. In church, Pastor Merrill prayed for a road, a mill, and a favorable change in the wind, but the wind only shifted to push the snow from a new direction. Samuel Price was cheerful at first. He'd stand on the store porch in a warm coat with a fur collar and tell everyone who passed that he had everything planned out. His pantry held more flour than any house in Black Creek. He had barrels of beans, boxes of salted beef, sacks of oats, sugar, coffee, and several barrels of molasses. He'd often said that thrift was a businessman's virtue, only no one reminded him that he'd laughed at Eli's thriftiness that summer. People easily forget their own words until those words become a knife at their throat. By the end of December, Price stopped releasing flour without recording it in the debt ledger. At first, this was accepted calmly. It was always like this. Take it in the winter, give it back in the spring. Then he began reducing the portions. A whole sack could no longer be purchased, even if someone had the money. He doled out a few pounds at a time, then one at a time, then began claiming that the flour was needed primarily by families with children, but in reality, the first to receive it were those whose land, livestock, or house could be confiscated in the spring. Eli saw this without childish naivety. He came to the store not to buy anything, but to hear news. He stood by the door as if simply warming his hands and listened. Some asked for flour. Some offered to pawn their tools. Some cursed. Some left silently, because pride is sometimes stronger than hunger, but never longer than hunger. Price noticed the boy and grimaced each time. "What, savage? Have you come to see how civilized people eat real bread?" Eli didn't answer. He wasn't looking at Price's face, but at the bags behind him. There were fewer of them. Much fewer. The shopkeeper was still speaking loudly, but his eyes began to dart frequently toward the warehouse. A man who fears losing power first becomes louder, then more brutal. At the Whitcombs' home, everything was different. There were no grandiose words. Eli's mother, Sarah, rose before dawn, stoked the stove with kindling, and cooked a thin porridge from whatever they'd decided to open that day. She barely touched the wheat flour. Eli himself asked her to hide it in a small box under the bed and only take it out when sick. Acorns became the staple food. At first, Sarah eyed the grey cakes with doubt, then learned to mix acorn flour with grated dried bark, a pinch of salt, and hot water. The cakes turned out dark and dense, with a bitter forest scent, but they kept the stomach full, and in winter, food that keeps the stomach full is almost a miracle. Eli handled the supplies carefully. He didn't allow himself to rejoice in being right. Being right when children around him are starving brings no joy. He counted the bags, checked the bark, turned the dried layers over to prevent dampness. 3 boxes stood in the corner of the barn. On the first, written in charcoal, was December. On the second, January. On the third, February. The inscriptions were simple, but to Sarah they seemed almost terrifying. They contained something the village lacked, an admission that the trouble would last. One evening, Mrs. Harper came to visit. She stood on the threshold, clutching her youngest daughter wrapped in a blanket to her chest. The woman's face was red from the wind, but her eyes seemed dry and dull. Her husband had broken his leg when the roof of the barn collapsed under the snow, and now their house was short of both hands and food. She didn't ask directly. People rarely know how to ask directly while they still have a shred of pride left. "Sarah," she said quietly, "do you know if Price gave anyone any flour today?" Sarah looked at Eli. It was a brief glance, but it held everything. Question, fear, permission. Eli went into the barn, returned with a small canvas bag, and handed it to Mrs. Harper. "Mix it with hot water," he said. "It's best to stir it for a long time. If there's a drop of molasses in it, the kids will eat it easier." The woman opened the package and saw grey flour. "Is this made from acorns?" Eli nodded. The same expression he'd seen all summer flickered across her face. Doubt, awkwardness, almost disgust. But the daughter in her arms coughed softly, and the expression vanished. The mother had conquered her pride faster than an adult mind could come up with an excuse. "Thank you," Mrs. Harper said. The next day at school, Price's eldest son tried to make fun of Eli again. He picked up a piece of wood from the floor, stuck it in his mouth, and declared he was now eating like Whitcomb for breakfast. Several children laughed, but the laughter was weak. Many of them had empty stomachs, and empty stomachs don't mix well with ridicule. Then, little Emmy Harper stood up from the back of the class. "Mom baked his flatbreads yesterday," she said. "My sister slept without crying for the first time in 3 days." The classroom fell silent. Price's son dropped a piece of wood on the floor but said nothing more. Miss Reynolds pretended to straighten the book on her desk. She'd heard everything but didn't know what to do. Just a month ago, she'd called Eli's activities forest quirks. Now she felt ashamed. But shame in adults often hides behind a solemn silence. After school, she stopped Eli at the door. "Do you really know how to make flour from acorns?" He nodded. "And from the bark?" "Not from just any tree, only from the inside, from birch, pine, and sometimes elm. It needs to be dried and crushed. Acorns need to be soaked, otherwise they'll be bitter and give you a stomachache." Miss Reynolds looked at him as if he were not a boy who had been teased all year, but a book that no one had opened in time. "Who taught you this?" "Father." She wanted to say something kind, but the words failed her. Kind words spoken too late sounded like an apology, and she didn't know how to apologize. By Christmas, the road to the station had completely disappeared. Two men tried to ski to the neighbouring town but returned a day later with frostbitten cheeks and empty hands. One said the snow in the lowlands was taller than a man. The other said the wind knocked them off their feet in the open. No one else mentioned the trip. When the road outward disappears, the village begins to look inward, and what it sees is rarely pleasant. Price locked the warehouse with a new lock. He announced that henceforth flour would be issued only by decision of the elders. He designated himself, Mayor Caldwell, and the blacksmith, Wallace, who owed him for iron and therefore rarely argued, as the elders. Pastor Merrill was not invited. The pastor spoke too often of mercy, and mercy was an obstacle to good trade. That same evening, a crowd gathered outside the store. People demanded that the warehouse be opened and the supplies counted. Price stood on the porch with a gun, not because he intended to shoot, but because he wanted to remind everyone who wielded power. The wind fluttered his coat. The light from the window fell on his face from below, making him look older and angrier. "If we give everything away now, there'll be nothing left in a week," he said. "I'm the only one here thinking with my head." "You alone hold the key here," Pastor Merrill replied from the crowd. The phrase rippled through the crowd like a crack in ice. Price heard it and turned pale. He was used to being disliked, but not to being answered out loud. At that moment, Eli stood at the edge of the crowd, almost waist-deep in snow. No one looked at him. Everyone was looking at the warehouse door, behind which lay the flour. But Eli was looking at the sky. A low, grey heaviness hung over the rooftops. The smoke from the chimneys didn't rise straight up. It drifted down, hugging the ground, and crawled between the houses, as if looking for somewhere to hide. My father used to say, "When the smoke doesn't want to go up, expect heavy snow." Eli realized they had less time left than even Price thought. Another storm began overnight. The snow didn't fall in flakes. It fell in a solid white dust, clogging cracks, covering doorknobs, and weighing down roofs. By morning, 3 men had to dig out the schoolhouse door. By midday, the roof of the old grain shed near the mill had collapsed, burying several sacks of oats that Price had hoped to retrieve later. When the men dug out the shed, the oats were mixed with snow, earth, and wood chips. They were still good enough to feed the horses, but no longer useful to the people. That evening, Price came to the Whitcombs' house himself for the first time. He didn't knock right away. Eli saw him from the window, a dark figure on the porch, his fur collar raised, his hand clutching his cane. Price stood there for a long moment, as if hoping the door would open without him asking. But it didn't. Then he banged his cane on the frame. Sarah let him in silently. The shopkeeper entered and looked around the sparse room, the stove, the neatly stacked kindling, the small table, and the gray flatbreads lying under a towel. His gaze lingered on them for far too long. "They say," he began without taking off his gloves, "that you've learned how to make edible flour from forest food." Eli was sitting by the stove, mending the strap on his sack. He looked up. "They say you called this garbage just yesterday." Price clenched his jaw. Sarah quietly said her son's name, warning him, but Eli was no longer the boy who had been laughed at silently all summer. He had no intention of revenge, but he also had no intention of pretending it never happened. "The village might need your method," Price said. "Not you, the village." Eli looked at his clean gloves, at his expensive boots, at the face of a man who had come not to ask, but to take the request by force. "It's not my way," he said. "The forest gives it to those who don't laugh at the forest." Price blushed. "Don't play with words, boy. If you know how to make food last, you owe it to the grown-ups to know." Eli stood up slowly. There were bags of acorn flour on the shelf behind him, but Price couldn't see them. They were covered with an old cloth. The boy walked over to the table, picked up a cake, and broke it in half. A faint, almost imperceptible steam rose, but the smell was warm, nutty, and alive. "I will," Eli said, "but first you will tell the people the truth." "What other truth? How much flour is left in the shop?" Price froze, and then Sarah realized. Her son hadn't just been collecting acorns and bark. He'd been preparing all this time for more than just famine. He'd been preparing for the moment when adults would have to stop lying. That morning, Price didn't gather the men willingly. He was forced by circumstances, Eli, and the fear that was already thicker than smoke in every house. The shopkeeper understood that if he remained silent for another day, the men would come to the warehouse themselves, not with requests, but with crowbars. Hunger makes even the quietest man dangerous, because tomorrow disappears. All that remains is the mouth of a child today, which must be fed somehow. The church bell rang 3 times. This was usually used to summon people to a fire or a funeral. This time it was both, only without the fire and the coffin. The village was burying its confidence. People gathered in the church because it was the largest building in Black Creek. The stove in the corner smoked but provided little heat. Men stood against the walls, women sat in pews with children, and the elderly stood silent, staring at the floor. Pastor Merrill kept his hands on the Bible but didn't open it. He knew that people needed truth before prayer. Price stepped forward. He held a notebook with notes in his hands. The same notebook where he was accustomed to calculating other people's debts, other people's interest, and other people's future harvests. Now it contained something that could not be turned into profit. "There's enough flour left in the shop for 6 sacks, he said. A noise rippled through the church. Someone gasped. Someone cursed. Mrs. Harper hugged her daughter so tightly that the girl let out a soft squeak. Blacksmith Wallace rose from his pew. 6 sacks? You said we had supplies until spring. I said there was a supply, Price snapped, but I didn't say it was endless. You sold less than you brought in, said the pastor. Where is the rest? Price glared at him. The question was dangerous because many knew the answer. Some of the flour went to those who could pay. He kept some for himself. Some was wasted in the far corner of the warehouse because the roof had leaked, and Price didn't want to show people the loss. But he only told the truth that could no longer be hidden. 6 sacks, he repeated. If we divide them among the families, that won't last long. For how long? Miss Reynolds asked. Price didn't answer. Eli answered instead. He stood at the last bench next to his mother, thin, weather-beaten, wearing an old jacket. Many people only now noticed him. Just recently, they had been looking down on him. Now they had to turn around. If we give it only to children and the sick, it will last almost 3 weeks, he said. If we give it equally to everyone, it will last less than 10 days. The silence grew heavy. No one liked that the boy had made the calculation. But something else was worse. The calculation was correct. And then? Mrs. Harper asked. Eli didn't answer right away. He looked at the ice-caked windows, at the adults' faces, at Price, who was clutching the notebook as if he wanted to break it in half. Then you'll have to eat what you laughed at. The church was filled with noise again, but a different kind. Not laughter. There was no laughter anymore. It was the noise of shame, fear, and anger. People don't like it when a child reminds them they've been stupid, especially when the child is right.
"You want to feed the village bark?" said Mayor Caldwell.
He was a stocky, red-faced man who had previously tried to stay out of things. When there's plenty of food, the mayor talks about order. When the food runs out, he looks for someone to shift the responsibility to. Not the bark, Eli answered calmly. The inner bark. It's dried, crushed, and added to flour. The acorns need to be peeled, soaked, dried, and ground. If done incorrectly, they'll be bitter and hard on the stomach. If done correctly, you can bake them into flatbreads. It's food for animals, one of the men muttered. Eli turned towards the voice. Animals survive the winter better than us because they are not ashamed to eat what the forest provides. The words hit harder than he intended. Several men looked down. Blacksmith Wallace cleared his throat, as if he wanted to retort but couldn't find anything to say. Pastor Merrill nodded for the first time in the entire meeting. "What should we do?" he asked. That question changed everything. Before it, Eli was a boy to be talked about. After it, he became someone to be listened to. He walked over to the front bench and placed 3 small bags on it. The first contained peeled acorns. The second contained dried strips of inner bark. The third contained coarse grey flour. There are still acorns under the snow in the forest to the north. Many have disappeared under the ice, but not all. Under the oak trees, you need to dig down to the old foliage. Take only whole, mold-free ones. Don't strip the bark from living trees unless necessary. It's better to look for fallen birches and pines. Throw away the outer dark bark. You need the light layer underneath. Slice it thinly, dry it by the stove, and crush it. First, crack the acorns, then soak them. Change the water until it becomes clear. How long will it take? Miss Reynolds asked. If everyone works, the first grind will be ready in 3 days. You can use a little earlier, but it's best not to rush. 3 days, Price said. What do people eat today? Eli looked at him. You have 6 sacks of flour. Today you'll start distributing them properly. The church grew so quiet you could hear the coals crumbling in the furnace. Price turned pale. He'd come to the meeting thinking the boy would provide a way, and the power would remain his. But Eli didn't let him hide behind a way. He placed 2 things side by side: forest food and fair distribution. One without the other wouldn't save the village. The pastor covered the Bible with his palm. The flour will go to children, the sick, and those who will work on the harvesting and processing, he said. Not as payment, as support, so that people don't fall over. The mayor wanted to object, but he saw the faces around him and remained silent. Price remained silent too. His power rested on the bags, and there were too few bags left. That same day, 3 groups were formed. The first was to go into the forest for acorns and bark. The second was to prepare a soaking area in a hole by the stream, where the water still moved under the ice. The third was to dry and grind Eli's supplies. Miss Reynolds suggested the school as a workspace because the desks could be pushed against the walls and the stove held up better there than in the church. Eli agreed, but demanded that children under 10 not go into the forest. He said this so firmly that the adults didn't argue. The next morning, 12 men set out for the northern ravine. Eli went first. Behind him were Pastor Merrill, the blacksmith Wallace, 2 farmers, 3 older boys, Miss Reynolds, and several women with sacks. Price didn't go. He said he had to guard the warehouse. No one tried to persuade him. A man with a gun and clean gloves would be of little use in the woods. The snow reached the adults' thighs. Every step was heavy. The wind was weaker in the ravine, but the frost bit their faces like iron. The oak trees stood black, bare, motionless. Beneath them, Eli stopped and showed them where to dig. At first, the men worked awkwardly. They were accustomed to taking from the earth in summer, when it was soft and generous. The winter earth demanded strength and patience. Shovels scraped through the crust, fingers went numb, breath froze on scarves. But after a while, acorns began to emerge from under the snow and leaves. 1, 2, dozens. Not all were good. Some were empty, some had turned black, some had been chewed by mice. Eli quickly discarded the bad ones and piled up the good ones. "Look at the cap," he explained to Price's eldest son, who was now silent and digging nearby. "If it smells sour, throw it out. If it's dark inside, throw it out. Don't pity the bad. The bad will ruin the good." The boy nodded. His face was no longer insolent. Hunger teaches faster than school. Eli demonstrated how to strip the bark from a fallen birch tree. Wallace, a blacksmith accustomed to hammering, drove his knife too deep and ruined the first piece. Previously, he would have laughed or cursed. Now he just looked at Eli. "So?" "No," said the boy. "Thinner. We're not taking the tree. We're taking the layer between the tree and the rough bark." Wallace tried again. This time it worked. A light streak appeared on his palm. He stared at it for a long moment, as if he couldn't believe he'd been passing food by his whole life without recognizing it. By evening, they returned with 6 sacks of acorns and 2 sacks of bark. People gathered near their houses to watch them carry their spoils. No one laughed. Even those who wanted to couldn't. The sacks looked too much like hope. At school, work continued until nightfall. Older children cracked acorns. Women sorted kernels. Miss Reynolds wrote the order on the board. Peel, soak, change the water, dry, pound. She wrote it carefully, like a grammar lesson, but she knew it was more important than any grammar she taught. Eli went from table to table, correcting, explaining, and correcting mistakes. He was 12, but that evening the adults waited for his nod, the way they used to wait for the mayor's decision. Late that night, Sarah found him by the school stove. He was sitting on the floor, leaning against the wall, holding a small sack of the first communal acorn meal. His eyes were closing with exhaustion. "You did more than you should have," she said. Eli shook his head. "No, not yet." Outside, the wind shifted again. It was shifting from north to east, and that was bad. My father said that an east wind, after a long frost, brings heavy snow and a crust of ice. Such a crust traps everything: grass, roots, acorns, tracks, roads. If it came tonight, the forest would yield much less. Eli opened his eyes and looked out the dark window. "We have to go again tomorrow," he said, "while the forest can still be dug up." By morning, the east wind brought exactly what Eli had feared. The snow no longer fell in a light dusting. It fell in heavy, wet flakes, clinging to their sleeves, clogging their eyelashes, turning every step into a struggle. Then, closer to midday, a fine, freezing rain began to fall. It quietly rustled across the roofs, branches, and crust, and the sound held no threat to those who didn't understand its meaning. But Eli did. The ice crust covered the forest like a lid on a chest. Anything they couldn't get to today would have to be chopped down with an axe tomorrow. He didn't wait for the adults to gather themselves. He grabbed a sack, a knife, and a short shovel and headed for the church. Pastor Merrill was already standing there, wrapped in an old army coat. Blacksmith Wallace, 2 farmers, and Miss Reynolds, her hands bandaged with wool, were shifting nearby. Everyone's expressions were tired, but the previous doubt was gone. In one night, they realized the boy wasn't making up horror stories. He was simply calling winter by its true name. "We need to get more bark today," Eli said. "It'll be hard to find acorns under the bark. If the ice sets, we'll have to break the crust, and the men are running low on energy. Bark can be stripped from fallen trees faster." "What if there aren't enough fallen ones?" Wallace asked. Eli looked at the northern forest. The black trunks stood behind a white shroud, as if silent and awaiting a decision. "Then we'll take them from the living, but only in strips, not in a ring. If you take them all around, the tree will die. If you take them narrowly from one side, it might survive." Wallace nodded. A month ago, he would have said the boy was teaching him how to handle wood. Now he listened attentively. This was the first real change in Black Creek. The adults were still ashamed, but they no longer argued with what could save their children. 9 men set out into the forest. Price's son Nathan also came, despite his father's orders. He hung back and barely looked up. Eli noticed him, but said nothing. There are times when a man must be allowed to do the right thing without witnesses, lest pride lead him back to foolishness. Nathan carried 2 empty sacks and an old hoe. His hands were red, lacking proper gloves, so he must have left the house quickly before his father saw. The forest greeted them with a heavy silence. Ice had already covered the thin branches with a transparent skin. Every gust of wind made the trees jingle, as if thousands of tiny glass bones hung somewhere overhead. The crust beneath their feet didn't give way immediately, but with a crunch, and the crunch was all too loud. The men dispersed among the oaks, but the work proceeded more slowly than yesterday. Under the snow, the layer of leaves froze into a dense mass. The shovels slipped. Their fingers went numb. Acorns were rarer, and those they found were often encased in ice. Eli quickly realized that if they continued like this, the day would be lost. He called everyone to the fallen pine tree he'd noticed in the fall. The trunk lay at the edge of a ravine, half covered in snow. The outer bark was rough and frozen, but underneath lay the necessary light layer. The boy knelt down, made a cut, carefully lifted it with a knife, and removed a long, thin strip. Then he showed them how to cut it into narrow strips to dry it faster. "This is not bread," said one of the farmers, looking at the stripes. "No," Eli replied. "It's what will keep you alive until bread comes again." No one objected. The phrase was too precise. By midday, the sacks were starting to fill. People were working without their usual squeamishness. Miss Reynolds, who used to teach children beautiful writing and correct words, now sat in the snow and peeled bark from a pine tree, ignoring the sap on her skirt. The pastor folded the strips into a sack and quietly counted how many families would get at least a handful each. Wallace chopped ice at the oak tree roots to get to the acorns. Nathan Price worked separately, silently and furiously, as if he wanted to reclaim from the earth everything his father hadn't been able to save in the store. The danger didn't come from the sky, it came from below. At the edge of the ravine, the crust seemed firm, but beneath it remained a void, blown away by the wind. Nathan stepped into the smooth snow and the earth vanished beneath his feet. He sank in immediately up to his chest. The hoe flew from his hands and the sack rolled down. The boy screamed, not from pain at first, but from sudden fear. Then the snow beneath him began to shift and he began sliding into the ravine. Wallace rushed first, but Eli shouted so sharply that the blacksmith stopped. "Don't come near! There's a cornice!" Not everyone understood the word, but they did understand the tone. Eli lay down on the snow, spreading himself out so his weight was distributed more evenly. He crawled to the edge and saw Nathan below, clinging to a root. Below him, a dark ravine opened up. Not deep enough to break a leg or neck, and in a winter like this, a broken leg could be a death sentence for the entire family. "Take off your belts," Eli said. "Quickly, tie them together, and your scarves too." The adults obeyed without question. Yesterday, this would have been impossible. Today, no one argued. Belts, scarves, and 2 ropes from the sacks were tied into a long loop. Eli checked the knots, adjusted the one the farmer had made, and tossed the end to Nathan. "Wrap it around your chest, not around your arms. You can't hold on to your arms." Nathan tried, but his fingers were difficult to control. Eli saw that fear was making his movements stupid. Then he said more calmly, "Look at me, not down, at me." "Wrap it under your arms and tie it like a sack of grain." Nathan did it. Wallace and the pastor lay down on the snow behind Eli. The rest formed a line further back from the edge. They pulled slowly, without jerking. One sharp tug could have broken the ledge and dragged 2 more down. Finally, Nathan tumbled over the edge and fell onto the crust, his whole body shaking. His boot remained below. His face was white, his lips blue. Miss Reynolds wanted to lead him back immediately, but Eli stopped her. "Wrap your foot first, otherwise it'll freeze until you reach the village." He removed his outer scarf, wrapped it around Nathan's leg, then added dry strips of bark between the fabric and the boot of his other foot. Wallace watched, frowning. "Is bark good here too?" "Dryness holds air," Eli said. "Air holds heat." Wallace didn't answer. He only tightened the knot. They returned earlier than planned, but not empty-handed. 4 sacks of bark, 2 sacks of acorns, 1 frightened boy, and 1 new piece of knowledge. Eli can do more than gather forest food. He can think in times of need. This was harder for the adults to accept than the usefulness of acorns. Food can be accepted out of need. A child's wisdom must be accepted through shame. When Nathan entered the shop, Price first rushed toward him, then saw Eli at the door. A flicker of relief crossed the shopkeeper's face, quickly replaced by anger. He needed to unleash fear on someone. "You took my son to the ravine?" he asked. Nathan raised his head. "He pulled me out." Price fell silent. People were standing in the shop, having come for their daily flour allotment. Everyone had heard. Price could have continued his accusations, but then he would have looked like an ungrateful fool, not a stern father. For the first time in a long time, he was at a loss for words. That evening, bark was drying at school. Thin strips hung on ropes near the stove, lay on boards, and were laid out on overturned desks. The smell was unusual: resin, damp wood, smoke, and hot earth. Children were cracking acorns with stones. Women were changing the water in buckets. Miss Reynolds was writing new rules on the board. Don't use mouldy things. Don't dry too close to the fire. Don't grind raw things. Don't eat bitter things without soaking them. These rules didn't come from a book. Eli dictated them, and she wrote them. Late that evening, Price arrived. Without his fur collar, without his gun, without his usual loud voice. He stood by the schoolhouse door, watching the people work around the grey bark and acorns that he had laughed at all summer. Then he approached Eli and placed a small key on the table. "This is from the back storeroom," he said. "There's also a sack of oats there. I kept it for my horse." The people looked up. Price didn't look at them. "The horse can wait," he added. "The children can't." It wasn't an apology, not a real one, But in Black Creek, even such a step came at a high price. Eli took the key, but didn't celebrate. He was too tired for victory, and knew all too well that one sack of oats couldn't undo everything the shopkeeper had done. "The oats need to be ground coarsely," he said. "We'll mix them with acorns. It'll be easier to eat." Price nodded, simply nodded to the boy he called a savage. On the third day after the freezing rain, the first communal stew was ready. A dark, thick mass of the last honestly given flour, acorns, oats, bark and salt simmered in the large church kettle. It didn't smell festive. It wasn't pretty. It didn't resemble the white bread that Black Creek had been proud of in the fall. But when Mrs. Harper lifted the first spoonful to her youngest daughter's lips, the girl swallowed and asked for more. That's when people believed completely for the first time. Not Eli's words, not his calculations, not shame and not fear. They trusted the spoon, which returned to the child's mouth for the second time. Black Creek didn't change immediately after that first potluck. People don't wake up wise overnight. They simply fall silent where they used to laugh. People no longer shouted after Eli in the streets. The children at school stopped pretending to be squirrels and chewing wood chips as a joke. Women passing Sarah Whitcomb nodded not with pity, but with cautious respect, as if only now noticing that her house, poor and dark as it was better prepared than many houses with curtains, carpets, and full summer pantries. But respect didn't fill their stomachs. Work did. Every morning, before the frost turned the air to cutting powder, groups would head out to the northern forest. They weren't as far as they had been in the first few days. Their strength had waned, so Eli reorganized the men. Strong men broke up the crust and dug acorns from under old leaves. Women and older children stripped the inner bark from fallen trees. At the school, it was dried, pounded, and sifted through a fine cloth. The coarsest part was saved for stew. The finest was added to flatbreads. The flour came out grey, heavy, and unfamiliar. But each sack was now greeted as a sack of wheat from the mill used to be. Eli no longer had time to be just a boy. He was called to school, to church, to Price's warehouse, where they had begun keeping honest records. Pastor Merrill insisted that every pound be recorded on the common board, not in the shopkeeper's notebook. Price resisted at first, then relented. Not because he had become kind, because he realized the old authority had ended, along with the old torment. Now the village was held together not by his keys, but by the grey mixture in wooden tubs and the boy he had humiliated for too long. The hardest part was teaching people not to waste their food. Hunger forced them to hurry. Someone tried to grind acorns after the first soak, and the cakes turned out so bitter that the children winced and cried. Someone dried the bark directly over the fire, and it turned black, brittle, and smelled of smoke. Eli walked from table to table, repeating the same thing. If done poorly, the food would become a punishment. If done correctly, it would give them a day. He spoke simply, without pride, but it was still hard for the adults to accept criticism from a 12-year-old boy, especially for those who, just a month ago, had called him a forest animal. One day, Blacksmith Wallace lost his temper. He threw a lump of poorly dried bark on the table and angrily declared that no one should live on wood dust. The school fell silent. Everyone expected Eli to respond harshly, but the boy merely picked up the lump, broke it open, and revealed its dark, damp centre. "This will be mouldy by morning," he said. "If it ends up in the general bag, it'll ruin everything." "You can be angry, Mr. Wallace, but anger won't make mould go away." The blacksmith stared at him for a long moment, then silently took the spoiled lump and tossed it into the kiln. From that day on, he became the most attentive worker at the drying boards. People remembered not his outburst, but the fact that the boy didn't humiliate him in return. This too was part of Eli's strength. He didn't waste time on revenge. Winter had already taken its revenge for everyone. By early February, the village was living under a new order. White flour was no longer used for adults. It was saved for the sick, infants, and those children who had already begun to lose weight too quickly. Acorns, bark, leftover oats, dried herbs, and sometimes beans, if a family brought a handful from their last reserves, went into the communal pot. In the evenings, they ate in silence in church. No one called it delicious, but after eating, people got back on their feet.
And in winter, that was the most important thing.
And yet, supplies were low.
Eli saw this before anyone else. He saw the boxes empty quickly. He saw people returning from the forest with smaller sacks. The ice crust had thickened, and beneath it, acorns had frozen to the ground, and there were almost no fallen trees left near the village. To find new bark, they had to go further, beyond the northern ravine, to the old pine patch. The forest was richer there, but the path was more dangerous. His father forbade Eli to go there alone, even in summer. In winter, the place became a trap. Deep gullies under the snow, hidden roots, a steep descent to the stream, and a wind that swirled in the ravine so much that a person could lose direction in just a few steps. But the choice was becoming less. That evening, Eli laid out the remaining supplies before the pastor, Miss Reynolds, and Mayor Caldwell. Price was there too, standing against the wall and not interfering. Small sacks lay on the table: flour, acorns, bark, oats. Once, such things would have seemed ridiculous for a gathering of adults. Now they looked like a war map. "If the storm doesn't get any worse and we keep eating like this, it'll last for 12 days, Eli said. "If the children start getting sick, it'll be less." "It's more than a month until spring," said Miss Reynolds. No one corrected her. Everyone knew it could be even longer before true spring. In Black Creek, the calendar had long since ceased to dictate the weather. "What do you propose?" asked the pastor. "Tomorrow we go beyond the ravine. There are old pine trees there. We can take the inner bark. There were also oak trees there, if the acorns haven't sunk under the ice." The mayor shook his head. "It's too far. People are weak." "That's why those who can still stand should go," Eli replied, "and get back before dark. If the wind picks up, we'll turn right back." Price spoke for the first time. "I'll go." Everyone looked at him. The words came so unexpectedly that even the stove cracked louder than usual. Nathan, sitting by the door, looked up. The shopkeeper didn't look at his son. "I have a sleigh," Price said. "A small one, for bags. The horse is weak, but it will make it to the ravine." Eli studied his face. He didn't trust Price, but trust was a luxury right now. They needed a sleigh. They needed a horse. They needed hands. "Then you will go," said the boy. "But you will not be listening to yourself." Price wanted to flare up. You could tell by the way his neck tensed. But he only nodded. Slowly, heavily. For him, it was almost an admission of defeat. At dawn, 6 of them set out. Eli, Price, Wallace, Pastor Merrill, Nathan, and Farmer Briggs. Miss Reynolds wanted to go with them, but Eli refused. The school needed to continue drying and distributing food. The entire village's work couldn't depend on a single trip. He'd learned this from his father too. A good supply isn't just what's in the sacks, but also an order that won't be disrupted if one person doesn't return. The path to the ravine turned out to be worse than Eli expected. The snow beneath the icy crust held the sleigh, but not always the men. A leg would suddenly sink in, up to the knee, sometimes up to the hip. Price's horse moved slowly, breathing heavily and steaming.
Price held the reins, and for the first time, his expression lacked self-assurance. In the forest, he wasn't a shopkeeper, just a man in the snow who didn't recognize us. Beyond the ravine they found pine trees. The trunks stood tall and dark, their bark coated with ice. Several trees had been felled by the storm. Eli immediately showed them which ones were suitable. The work proceeded quickly. Wallace chopped off the outer bark. Eli and Nathan removed the lighter layer. The pastor folded the strips, and Briggs loaded the sacks onto the sled. Price kept his distance at first, then knelt down next to his son and began cutting the bark as Eli had shown, awkwardly but diligently. By midday, the sleigh was almost full. It wasn't a victory, but a reprieve. A week's worth of food, maybe more if mixed carefully. Eli allowed himself his first deep breath of the day. At that moment, he noticed the wind had died down. Too abrupt. The forest fell silent. Even the icy branches stopped ringing. The air grew thick, as if before a blow. The pastor also raised his head. "Is this good?" he asked. Eli was already looking west. Beyond the trees, the sky was darkening, not grey, but a heavy green blue. He'd seen that colour once before, the day his father died. "No," he said. "Drop everything unnecessary. We're leaving now." They had only made it halfway to the ravine when the storm hit. It didn't come gradually. It didn't give them time to adjust. First, the air rushed away. Then a white wall obscured the trees, the sleigh, the people, even the horse's head. The wind hit him in the back, spun Briggs around, and knocked Nathan to his knees. The horse whinnied and lurched. Price held onto the reins, but the sleigh lurched, and one sack fell off and disappeared into the snow. "Leave!" Eli shouted. "Hold on to the sled!" But the wind ate his voice. They huddled near the ravine, almost blindly. Eli led the way, testing the snow with a stick. He knew there had to be an old birch stump somewhere nearby. The trail curved left from it. But everything was gone. The world became a white circle a few steps long. Behind him, Price was shouting something to Nathan. Wallace was cursing, and the pastor was saying a prayer, not out loud, but with his breath. The horse was shaking. And then, there was no ground under Eli's feet. He only managed to swing his stick to the side and feel the crust break. His body sank, snow slammed into his face, his shoulder caught painfully on the icy edge. He didn't fall far. A root protruding from the ravine wall stopped him. But the stick disappeared, the bag fell off, and the snowstorm was already covering the edge of the chasm, as if trying to seal it off from the rest. "Eli!" Nathan shouted. The boy tried to answer, but his mouth was full of snow. He hung sideways, clinging to a root with one hand. Below him was the dark, empty ravine. Above him was a white noise through which people could pass within 2 steps and not see him. For the first time all winter, Eli felt real fear. Not for the village, not for the supplies, but for the fact that he would die almost exactly where his father had died, less than a mile from people who wouldn't be able to find him. Eli didn't know how long he hung above the ravine. In a blizzard, time ceases to be minutes. It becomes the pounding of his heart, the pain in his fingers, and the snow that collects under his collar. The root he was holding onto was thick but wet with sleet. His hand slowly slipped. His shoulder burned as if it were being wrenched from its socket. He tried to pull himself up, but the snow beneath his chest crumbled, and each tug only further revealed the dark void beneath his feet. There was shouting above, but the voices were drowned out by the wind. Eli heard fragments: a name, Wallace's curse, the wheeze of a horse, Nathan calling his name over and over again. Then a figure appeared over the edge. Not Wallace, not the pastor. Price. The shopkeeper lay on his stomach in the snow, clutching the strap that led back to the sleigh with both hands. His face was grey from the cold. Ice hung on his brows. There was no pride or contempt left in his eyes. Only fear. The real, naked fear of a man who suddenly realized he might lose the boy he'd laughed at all summer.
"Give me your hand," he shouted.
Eli wanted to say he couldn't reach, but all that came out was a wheeze. Price slid lower. Too far. The snow cracked beneath him. Somewhere behind him, Wallace yelled at him to stay still, but Price reached out anyway. His fingers touched Eli's sleeve and slipped. Then Nathan dropped next to his father, strapped in with the second belt, and handed the boy a long strip of freshly cut pine bark. "Grab it!" Nathan shouted. "Wrap it around my wrist!" Eli understood. Dry bark would have torn, but the fresh inner strip was flexible and strong, like rough ribbon. He gripped it with his fingers, wrapped it around his hand, and made a loop, just like he'd taught him to tie sacks. Price grabbed the other end. Nathan lay on top of his legs. Wallace and the pastor tugged from behind. Slowly. Not a jerk. Eli felt the snow cut into his face. The edge of the ravine hit his chest, the root finally letting go of his hand. Another moment, and he tumbled over the edge, fell onto the crust, and lay there, unable to believe there was earth beneath him again. Price knelt nearby, breathing heavily. His gloves were torn. Blood had appeared on his palm, quickly darkening from the cold. He looked at Eli and said nothing. Perhaps for the first time in years, he had no words that could elevate him above another person. "Alive?" Wallace asked, leaning over the boy. Eli nodded, though his vision was blurry. His shoulder ached, but the bones were intact. He tried to rise, but Price suddenly placed a hand on his back. "Lie down," he said. "Listen to an adult for once." On another day, this phrase might have sounded like an order. Now it was a request. They lost one sack of bark and almost half the acorns, but the sled was still loaded. They had to hitch a team back. Price led the way with the horse. Wallace held the sled's tail. The pastor and Briggs supported Eli, and Nathan carried the knife and sack of the best bark. The wind blew sideways, knocking their breath away, erasing their tracks instantly. Twice they lost their way, and only Eli, his eyes barely open, directed them from memory. To the left of a crooked birch tree, down the hard crust, then to a low rock that was almost invisible in winter. He himself could barely stand, but he remembered the route the way others remembered prayers. By the time they reached the first houses in Black Creek, it was already dark. People were standing by the church with lanterns. Sarah Whitcomb ran out before everyone else. She didn't shout. She simply reached her son, hugged him, and held him so tightly as if she could shield him from the entire winter with her body. Price looked at them for a few seconds, then turned away and ordered them to take the bags into the school. His voice was firm again, but no longer commanding, workmanlike. That night, the last of the white flour from the store was emptied into the communal cauldron. Price brought it himself. The small sack, once hidden for his family, lay in his hands like a confession. He placed it before the pastor and said loudly so everyone could hear, "I don't have any more." These words should have frightened the village. But they didn't frighten it the way they would have a week ago. Because nearby, on the school desks, lay strips of pine bark. Acorns were soaking in tubs. Dark grains were drying on boards. By the stove, Miss Reynolds was stirring a new batch of flour, and the children who had recently laughed at Eli were carefully turning the cakes so they wouldn't burn. The last of the flour was gone, but the food did not end with it. It was the moment when Black Creek finally understood the difference between reserves and hope. Reserves can be hidden, sold, or locked away. Hope emerges when people know what to do when the keys no longer open. February became the hardest month. The frost lingered so long that the nails in the doors were coated with frost on the inside. 2 houses had to be abandoned because their stoves had cracked. Families were moved into the church and school. There they slept on benches, tucking the children under every blanket. A stew of acorns, bark, and oats became a daily meal. Sometimes they added beans, sometimes a piece of salt beef if someone found a forgotten package in their cellar. But most often it was simply dark, thick, and heavy. No one winced anymore. Every spoonful meant another day. Eli couldn't go into the woods for almost 2 weeks. His shoulder was swollen and the fingers on his right hand were stiff. He sat by the stove in school, teaching others. He showed them how to identify a bad acorn, how long to change the water, how to dry bark so it doesn't mold, how to mix coarse flour with hot water so the cake doesn't crumble. Miss Reynolds wrote everything down in a thick school notebook. On the first page she wrote, Eli Whitcomb's Winter Rules. When Eli saw it, he blushed and asked her to cross it out. She didn't. Price didn't change right away. People like that don't change from one good deed. But he started doing things he hadn't done before. He worked with his hands. He carried water. He chopped ice at the school entrance. He sold his shelves for firewood. One day, he approached Sarah and quietly told her that her husband's flour debt was settled. Sarah looked at him for a long moment, then replied that the IOU was no longer heavy for the dead, but it was hard for the living to remember who held it. Price accepted these words in silence. Sometimes, silence is the first honest answer. At the beginning of March, the wind brought the first hint of dampness. Not warmth yet, but change. The snow on the roofs grew heavier. During the day, a thin trickle of water appeared on the south side of the church. Children ran out to see it, as if it were a miracle. The adults didn't rejoice out loud. They were afraid to scare away spring. But that evening, the soup in the church seemed a little less bitter to everyone. When the road to the mill finally opened, people from the neighbouring town arrived in Black Creek with flour, salt, and news. They expected to find the village dead. Rumours had already circulated. The road snowed in, the mill abandoned, the store empty, the cattle dead. But they found the people thin, exhausted, with weathered faces, and alive. In the schoolhouse, bark was still drying on ropes. The last acorns lay in tubs. A boy with a bandaged shoulder sat by the stove, demonstrating to 2 grown men how to properly pound flour. From that day on, the word savage was no longer spoken in Black Creek. Not because everyone had suddenly become kind, but because the word had become dangerous for those who spoke it. It reminded them not of Elijah, but of themselves, of how they had laughed at knowledge because it came not from a store, not from a school, not from a rich man, but from a boy with a sack of acorns and bark in his pockets. In the spring, the villagers planted more potatoes than ever before. Every family now had a cellar, or at least a pit under the floor. A communal drying shed was built near the school. Miss Reynolds included lessons not only on reading and arithmetic, but also on identifying edible things in the forest, how to store food, how to read the wind, and how to watch birds. Price set aside the back of his storeroom for the communal pantry, and the key was no longer kept by him alone, but by the pastor, the teacher, and Sarah Whitcomb. Eli began going into the forest again once his shoulder healed. Only now he wasn't alone. Children followed him with sacks, listening attentively to every word. He showed them oaks, birches, and pines, explaining why you shouldn't take more than you need, why you shouldn't strip a living tree, why you shouldn't pity a bad acorn. Nathan Price walked alongside him more often than the others. He no longer tried to joke. One day, at the northern ravine, he stopped and said, I really thought you were just weird back then. Eli looked at the snow that still lay in the shadows between the roots, although streams were already flowing in the village. I thought adults knew what they were doing too, he replied. We were both wrong. Nathan grinned, but not maliciously. Then he picked up the bag and moved on. Over the years, stories about that winter in Black Creek varied. Some said the village was saved by acorns, others by bark. Still others by the pastor, the school, and the community kettle. But the elders who survived that frost always corrected them. It wasn't what the boy found in the forest that saved the village. The forest had always been there. Acorns fell every autumn. Bark was within reach of anyone who passed a tree. Black Creek was saved by the fact that one boy was not ashamed to look like a savage, when everyone else was too proud to call themselves civilized.